aren't you making a mockery of the voters that put their trust in you at the general election? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. I will set out the individual policies at the budget on the 26th of November. That's not what today is about. As Chancellor, I have to face the world as it is, not the world that I want it to be. And when challenges come our way, the only question is how to respond to them, not whether to respond or not.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Capitalist. I'm Joseph, the Deputy Editor of CapX. My guests today are Reem Ibrahim of the Institute of Economic Affairs and Henry Hill of Conservative Home. Today we've got a special edition of the podcast because we're going to be talking about the Chancellor's speech this morning ahead of the fiscal event later this month. Rachel Reeves gave every indication that tax rises are coming, though she was careful not to name any names. Raising the cash usually means turning to one of the big three, that's income tax, national insurance or VAT. But Labour's manifesto ruled raising those, leaving Reeves with a fiscal puzzle and not much room to move. So where will she look instead? Henry, if we could start with you, where's she going to get this cash from if she sticks to her fiscal rules?
I mean, if I knew that, I would be paid vastly more money to advise high net worth clients, if I knew that precisely. I mean, I suspect that she will, if not at this budget, then at some point soon just have to break them. Essentially, Labour is caught in a vice between the reality of Britain's fiscal position and its manifesto, which refused to basically make any difficult decisions, perhaps because they'd learnt the long lesson of the 2017 election when they managed to close a 25-point gap in the polls after Theresa May tried to do the right thing on social care. And so effectively they're now scrambling around for money, and we have already seen Reeves paring down capital budgets, doing all the normal self-destructive things that the British state does. Poor Wes Streeting, the health secretary, has got just 6 billion of extra capital money to transform the NHS. We hear that she's trying to sort of negotiate with the oil and gas companies in the North Sea about bringing an early end to the windfall levy on their profits. That levy has coincided with quite a big fall in net receipts, tax receipts from North Sea oil and gas, but she's trying to get guarantees from them that that this will produce more investment. And of course they're looking at Ed Miliband, the untouchable energy secretary, and his moratorium on drilling and thinking, why would we make long-term very expensive investments in this particular oil field? So she doesn't have any other way of raising the revenue. A wealth tax is a complete fiction. It would be very complicated to do. There's no evidence in other countries that it really raises money. Switzerland has one, but that's instead of things like capital gains tax, and the overall amount paid by wealthy people is relatively similar to here, to be honest. So there isn't one. The only way that she could not raise taxes and keep to the fiscal rules is to cut spending. But as we've seen, this government simply is incapable of cutting spending. The winter fuel allowance U-turn, the relatively trivial 5 billion of welfare cuts, Keir Starmer has completely folded on that. The Timms review now has no reference to any of those savings in his welfare review. And so there's no way out. Reeves, there's some talk about the fact that she might be doing expectation management, but I think that the blunt fact is that Reeves's only short-term way out is to raise taxes. But of course, the basic problem for Labour on that front is this is already a high tax country with a cost of living crisis, and sucking more money out of the economy is going to hurt a lot of voters if it's one of the big three revenue taxes, but also hurt hospitality and all of the other bits of the economy that depend on people having money to spend at the end of the week.
And Reem, what are your bets? Are we going to see an increase in taxation or spending cuts from Reeves later on this month?
I think my bet is almost certainly on the former, Joe. I think what's interesting is that we're seeing some rumours around potential increases either by 1 pence or 2 pence on income tax, which of course will have, disastrous impacts on things like wealth. It's sort of economics 101. When you increase taxation on a certain thing, whether that be an activity or a good, often that activity then happens less. So when you are increasing taxation on work, you are disincentivizing work from occurring in the first place. The problem is is, I mean, Henry's absolutely right with this assessment here. We are currently facing absolutely disastrous economic malaise, and the problem is that this is going to continuously get worse. I think something people don't necessarily realise is that, yes, we are going to see increases in tax at the budget at the end of this month, but if nothing changes, we are going to see increases in tax next year and the year after and the year after until we are perpetually a majority government economy. Public spending as a proportion of GDP is already at about 44%. That number is just going to continue to climb unless we fundamentally ask ourselves what the government can stop doing. And I think part of the problem is that there is so much that the government does that we are completely unwilling to reduce. And a lot of the big things are really things like pensions. The state pension, of course, is politically incredibly difficult to reform. But even just looking at the future long-term government liabilities, public sector pensions are just absolutely astronomical. A lot of the media tends to talk about them as being a sort of gold-plated pension, but the problem is that money doesn't currently exist. In the same way that the state pension doesn't currently exist, that money comes from future taxation, or indeed with public sector pensions, it comes out of future contributions. So as the population ages, as those demographic changes occur, the real strain on the public finances is just going to continue to get worse. And unfortunately, I think that we are going to continuously see more and more wealthy, ambitious, interesting people leave this great country, and I can't bear to see it in decline.
And Henry, the politics of this are pretty interesting. So Rachel Reeves has been going across the media basically saying that it's the Tories' fault that Labour are going to have to make all of these tough calls. Is there any credibility to that argument? I mean, it was under the Conservatives that our debt rose and taxes rose and spending rose. Is she right to be blaming them?
I mean, to an extent. It's certainly not the case, as some Conservative MPs are fond of saying, that they left Labour a strong economy. Although it is, of course, interesting when you hear that argument and you're like, okay, which bits of the Conservative spending agenda were you so opposed to, Rachel Reeves? Was it the doubling in real terms of NHS spending? Was it furlough that you opposed? Really, really interested to drill down in those figures. And so she ends up blaming Brexit, which was, of course, 5 years ago, and then austerity, which is closing in on 15 years ago, as the reasons that she's having to make all of these unexpected fiscal adjustments, which is faintly ridiculous. But the truth is that the problems are inherited from the Conservatives and they're inherited from New Labour, because the basic problem with the British economy, some of which Reem just set out, are deep structural problems that go back a very long way. The declining birth rate, the complete failure to build housing. The housing crisis was actually first foreseen in the 1970s. It really started to bite in the first 10 years of New Labour between 97 and 07. If you go back, it's weird the memory hole we have in British politics and journalism now. If you go back and you read journalism and reporting and writing after the great crash in 2008, one of the consistent themes is, why were we so exposed to it as a society? Because for years before 2007-8, we had been effectively simulating prosperity with cheap mortgages and cheap household debt. Lots of people racking things up on credit cards, furnishing their houses with 105% mortgages. So actually, the problems with the British economy go back 20 or 30 years. And both major parties, I mean, all three if you include the Liberal Democrats during the coalition, have to take responsibility for that. But of course, addressing those issues would mean challenging an awful lot of sacred cows. It would mean risking touching the third rails of British politics, which are things like housing and pensions. And most importantly of all, it would mean all of these people admitting fault, admitting that for an extended period of time, they presided over the systemic decay of the British economy. And of course, they're not willing to do that. So they always pick on short-term things. Is it Brexit? Is it something else? Is it something else in the last few years? No, Britain's problems are structural. We are a high-cost, low-wage economy with an unsustainable demographic trend, with three big revenue expenditure accounts, the NHS, social care and pensions, which are eating the government from the inside out. They're the reason that we don't have a functioning court system, we don't have a deployable military, but the scale of those problems is so blood-curdling, and frankly, the public's willingness to hear what it would take to address those problems so low, that we end up in this weird phantasmagoria where politicians are picking random, relatively trivial things in the last few years and pretending that relatively small adjustments to our overall GDP growth, which is basically fluctuating around zero,
And
matter.
if I just add to that, I think it's so interesting, the idea that you sort of alluded to this, Henry, the idea that there is some kind of external reason that the government have to make these so-called tough decisions. The idea that it was Brexit, or perhaps it was the pandemic, or perhaps there was something else, something that was completely out of the government's control, and that is fundamentally untrue. Yes, there is an impact when Donald Trump implements huge swathes of tariffs across the world. Of course there is a short-term fiscal impact. When we're thinking about why the UK is in such an abysmal state, it is directly as a result of the government's own decisions. It is directly as a result of the government's increasing of the tax burdens in the literal high since the Second World War. It is as a result of public spending being so extremely unaffordable. It is as a result of the government making promise after promise after promise and not being able to afford that, and then requiring so-called working people to then pay for that bill. So I think that when we're thinking about this from the political perspective, where Rachel Reeves is going to say, this isn't our fault, this was some kind of third alien that has imposed this kind of trauma on the United Kingdom's economy, is fundamentally untrue. This is their fault.
Yeah, so the man who's styling himself as the force to take on these kind of political and economic golden calves is of course Farage, who this week gave a speech of his own, and the speech pleased a lot of free marketers because it was full of lots of kind of Thatcherite rhetoric about the cost of the state and getting spending down. But he's also gone back on his pledge to cut £90 billion worth of taxes. Reem, is this a plan to be taken seriously as far as you're concerned?
The current state of affairs, no, I wouldn't say so. I mean, unfortunately, despite the fact that the rhetoric is incredibly sort of free market-esque and is something that somebody like myself would be particularly excited by, the substance was not there. I mean, he sort of discussed various different aspects of this in his speech. He said that we need to get Britain working again. We need to ensure that the welfare bill is being reduced. If you have anxiety, you shouldn't be on personal independence payments, for example. Unfortunately, I think that the rhetoric may be there, but the detail is not there. And actually, when we look at where there is some specificity, when it comes to things like whether or not we should abolish inheritance tax on family farms, a lot of it is effectively just political posturing. So to answer your question, Joe, no, I don't think that any of this is necessarily credible at the moment. But quite frankly, I don't see a credible economic plan from any political party, because the political party that does propose what actually needs to be done will not win office.
Yes, and Henry, were you at all impressed by his speech a couple of days ago? Is there some credibility there?
I mean, it's a small move in the right direction. Let's face it, if reform even looked like it was going to win the next election with 90 billion of unfunded tax cuts in its manifesto, the bond markets would disembowel the United Kingdom. It wouldn't even have to wait for him to enter office, to be honest. The problems would be that severe, and we are wildly exposed to them. But this isn't any better. I think that one of the fundamental contradictions at the heart of reform, and one of the reasons that obviously perhaps people will take this with a pinch of salt because I work for Conservative Home, but I am incredibly bearish on reform and their ability to actually fix anything in this country, is that reform's coalition is not a Thatcherite coalition. There was some fascinating research that came out, I think, last week, which showed that actually Farage has perhaps the single most government spending exposed seat in the entire country, and another one in the top 5 was also reform. The brutal, we've discussed, Reem and I have sort of covered the basics of the horrible state of Britain's fiscal position. But the thing that makes it so electorally toxic is that we're now in a position where I think only 1/3 of British adults are net contributors to the exchequer, right? Think about that. Of all British adults, 2/3 of all of them are on net receiving money from government rather than giving it to government. Now, how do you persuade an electorate, 2/3 of whom receive more from the state than they give, that we need to cut state spending? It's very, very difficult to do. It's not necessarily impossible to do if you target choose your targets really, really clearly and really quite brutally. But it is extraordinarily difficult. And Farage, I think, also has noted, because he is, if nothing else, an extraordinarily skilled campaigner, but not really anchored to anything beyond that, that the big opening for him at the next election is not in a Thatcherite space. Reform UK came second in 90-something seats, I think something like 97 seats at the last general election. All but 9 of those are Labour held, right? All but 9. So for all the talk about reform versus the Conservatives and what will reform do to the Conservatives, the basic fact is Labour are in office. Labour are becoming wildly unpopular because they're in government in Britain in 2025. And it will be probably much easier for reform to make more gains by targeting Labour than targeting the Conservatives. You're not going to pick up Labour switchers with that kind of hard Thatcherite rhetoric, especially not in large parts of the so-called left behind parts of the country, which are these days more or less propped up by government spending, be that directly or be that through the taxpayer subsidy of a university which simulates an economy in a town that otherwise wouldn't have one. So that's the political challenge facing reform. I don't think it's soluble. Is Farage going to get rid of the triple lock? No. Is he going to make people pay for their own social care? I think that's probably unthinkable. Is he going to privatise the NHS, quote unquote, or bring in a mixed provision system, as the IMF suggested that Britain do in its most recent report? No, he hasn't said so. But if you don't do anything about any of those big three, the fact is that working age welfare is a sideshow. It's not unimportant. I get angry when I read about Motability like everyone else. But the fact is that the three big items are pensions, social care, NHS. And if you don't do anything about one of those, probably two of those, you are simply not proposing anything that is going to make a difference to Britain's long-term trajectory.
Yeah, and also debt interest payments, I suppose, but that's part of the problem where we're borrowing more than we can afford. It's interesting, I think, with that perspective on actual policies that Reform have announced over the last year or so. I mean, around the election, it was quite exciting because there weren't those substantial policies being announced. There wasn't that sort of room to understand that Reform are going down this effectively left of Corbyn economic route. But what have we actually heard? Substantially, what have we actually heard? Removing the two-child benefit cap, which is, of course, an increase in public spending. We've had the nationalisation of steel. I mean, basically a lot of the aspects of the nationalisation of key utilities, a lot of the actual substantial policy announcements that we've heard, removing the rhetoric, which is generally quite free market. But the actual promises have been harking to that effectively traditional Labour base. And so a lot of the actual substantial promises we have heard from Reform have been left of Corbyn. They absolutely have not been Thatcherite or free market. And I think that Henry's right about the politics of this. It's effectively because it's a losing coalition. Perhaps the Conservative Party will end up being the sort of free market Thatcherite party as a result of that sort of division of Labour across the right. But unfortunately, I don't know how many seats there are to be won in that particular political circumstance.
So the verdict is it's all looking pretty bleak for the British taxpayer. I think that's what we can all agree on. Reem and Henry, thank you both so much for coming on. That's all we have time for. Make sure that you're subscribed to the CapX email. I'm Joseph. Thanks and goodbye.